Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this extra tip video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. We are going to be getting started piecing and free motion quilting in just a few more days. But until then, I wanted to give you some piecing tips today that would help you get started on the right foot. I'm going to be using these settings, I'm going to be using these tools throughout this piecing process. And just in case you ever are curious about what I'm using or why I'm doing what I'm doing, well, refer to this video so that way you'll know exactly what's going on. So the very first thing I wanted to share with you is my piecing foot. I'm going to be piecing on the Bernina 1230, which is an older machine, and I have this piecing foot on it. And basically it's called a patchwork foot. When your needle is in center position, to both sides you have exactly 1/4 of an inch, and this is extremely accurate. Now, of course, these feet are only compatible with Bernina machines. If you have a Bernina, you're super lucky. Go get yourself one of these. But if you don't have a Bernina, look around and try and find a patchwork foot. It's sometimes called a 1/4 inch foot. You need to get something accurate for your machine so you can piece with that accurate seam allowance. Patchwork, American style patchwork, I should say, is all dependent upon that 1/4 inch seam. Basically, the idea is we add that 1/4 of an inch, then we need to take that 1/4 of an inch away, which means we need to stitch and very carefully and exactly within that seam allowance. You stitch more, your block's going to end up slightly smaller than what it's supposed to be. You might also lop off some of your points if you have triangles in that block. It's not the end of the world if you don't have a patchwork foot or you can't find one for your machine. What you want to do is take your normal zigzag foot, place it on your machine, and then begin adjusting your needle and use a ruler to measure and see exactly where you reach that 1/4 of an inch, that exact 1/4 of an inch where you line up your fabric along the edge of the foot, and it's usually lined up along that right side of the foot. Your needle needs to move to where it's stitching, it's entering the fabric at exactly that 1/4 inch mark from the edge. So take some time, fiddle around with your machine, get used to moving that needle around, because if you have to move your needle, you're going to need to make that setting adjustment every time you set down to piece. So definitely remember it, maybe even write down where you move your needle or what foot you're using, so that way you can quickly get started whenever we're piecing these blocks this year. So a few more things that I'm using while we make this quilt together. I am using Arfil thread. This is 50 weight Mako cotton. I'm using it in a color that's going to match my fabric A, and that is this pretty blue fabric. So I've selected a thread, and obviously this is just a little darker, but it works okay. You want to use a thin cotton thread. I like cotton because it really locks in these pieces, it binds things together really, really nicely and securely. So it's really important that the thread that we use is high quality, and also if it's a cotton thread, that it's low lint. That's why I like this Arfil thread. It's very thin and it also has very low lint. This is important because if you're using a thread that's putting out lots of lint into your machine, you're going to need to brush out your machine with every single bobbin change, because it's literally going to fill up with, lint and dust. And that dust can lock up your machine completely, can break your machine. So make sure to select a thread that's high quality, that's nice and thin, because if you pick a really bulky thread for piecing, you'll actually end up adjusting your seam allowance. That thread, that bulky thread in that stitch, is going to widen your seam allowance, and that will shrink your block down, and again, it not be quite as accurate as you might like it to be. So while we're talking about thread, let's talk about settings. I'm going to kind of nail this into your head a little bit this year. The settings I use on my machine for piecing are pretty specific, and the only setting that I really have to adjust is the stitch length. I adjust my stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters. That means that my stitches are really close together. They're really locked together. Now, that also means that it's a real pain to pick out any messed up seams. So I try not to make any mistakes, but this is a very secure stitch because those stitches are so close together. They're locked in really, really tight. Those pieces do not want to come apart. The reason for this is when you're piecing, what we want to do is bring those pieces together and lock them together and make sure that they're secure. having a shorter stitch length means that you are accomplishing that. And you're also making sure that that thread is binding those pieces together. That short stitch length allows me to press my seam allowances open. And let me show you what this looks like. On the back of the block, I lift it up, I press the blue seam allowance, that 1/4 inch seam allowance to the blue side. I take that black seam allowance and I press it to the black side. I leave that seam open. And the reason I do that is it reduces the bulk of that seam allowance underneath the quilt. So here I am on the surface. Once we baste our blocks, we generally tend to forget all about that seam allowance. But when you start actually free motion quilting this, you'll remember real quick, because areas like this will get really dense and difficult to quilt if you press your seams to one side. It also creates a really noticeable ridge when you press your seams to one side. So I always press my seams open, and I'm able to do that because I use that really narrow stitch length and it locks those pieces together. So it's okay, it's not gonna be unstable. I'm not gonna mess up my quilt by doing this. I do get a lot of questions about that because pressing to one side is such a commonly taught method for quilting. I get asked a whole lot about pressing seams open and then stitching right in the ditch. Is that a bad thing, or is that going to mess up the quilt, or are those piecing stitches going to be broken by the quilting stitches? In my experience, no, never. I have been pressing my seams open since I began quilting, and I've been free motion quilting right in that ditch, right on top of those piecing stitches, and I've never had a problem with it. It's very accurate. It also makes stitching in the ditch easier, and it makes free motion quilting easier because all those seam allowances are pressed open rather than on one side where they're going to be really big and bulky and hard to get your foot over. So there's one last thing that I'm using for piecing, and it's really for piecing and free motion quilting, and that is a good marking pencil. In order to piece things like half-square triangles, we need to be able to mark some lines on our pieces, and we also need to make sure that we can erase those lines, or that they're basically going to come out of the fabric at some point. For marking, I am using this Fons & Porter marking pencil, and you can see the marks it makes here on this block. The nice thing is, though, they erase just as easily using the eraser on the end of the pencil or just brushing with your hands. Sometimes I find a paper towel, slightly damp paper towel, will get those marks off super, super quickly. So I hope that this little piecing tip video has helped you understand those steps to get started. If you don't have a piecing foot, you can't find one for your machine, make sure to come up with that adjustment to your machine. Figure out where you need to put your needle in order to have that accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance and stitch. Make sure that you're using a high quality thread with low lint so you don't damage your machine. That's really important. If you can't find anything else, though, just simply remember to brush out your machine religiously after every single bobbin change, and that will work. And of course, adjust your stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters. That's going to lock our pieces together nicely. And when you need to mark your blocks, make sure you're marking your blocks with a fabric marking pen or pencil that you've tested and made sure it comes out of your fabric. So that's it for this video. Definitely check out the Building Blocks quilt pattern at leahday.com and join us as we work together piecing and quilting this beautiful quilt in 2014. Until next time, let's go quilt.